typing like a fiend.
Oh,
I've
gosh.
written 40,000 words.
Really? Uh-huh.
So I feel like I'm really ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
Because
right.
I only want like 65 to 70.
Oh,
I'm
really?
halfway there.
Oh, yeah. And how many more weeks do you have?
14.
Oh, that's good. Well, coming up.
And the thing is, maybe I'm more sanguine about it than I believe. 99% of my career was financial. Source material is there.
Yeah,
The interviews are there.
that's good. Are we ready to start, Michael? Okay.
So who should I should talk to you, or I should talk to them?
Oh, well, you can look at them, or, wherever. Tonight we are welcoming Tom deFrank, who's the bureau chief of the New York Daily News, who worked at Newsweek as well for a long period of time covering the White House, and he was at the White House since the 1970s and has known several presidents and known them well. And one of the first presidents you knew well was Gerald Ford. Can you tell us how you got to know him?
Well, I'm happy to do that, Martha. I want to start, though, I want to dial back just with a little bit of biographical information about me so you all have some sense of my background, and then I'll go to how I got to know Gerald Ford. In June of this year, I will have been a Washington correspondent for 39 years. I arrived here on June the 10th, 1968. Actually, I arrived here on Saturday, June 8th, and I know that that's the date because I drove into town and drove out to north of Union Station here to see the funeral train carrying Robert F. Kennedy's body into Washington. And I can remember that the first image that is in my brain from my 39 years in Washington was the train going past, and at the back of it I could see the casket draped with an American flag and Ted Kennedy standing next to the casket of his brother. And that was on a Saturday. On Monday, June 10th, 1968, I started as an intern at Newsweek, and I've been here ever since. From 68 to 70, I was an Army officer at the Pentagon. I was a public affairs officer at Headquarters, Department of the Army. And I started at Newsweek in October of 1970. And from time to time in 1970, 71, 72, I would go to press conferences with Gerald R. Ford, who at the time was House Minority Leader. But I never met him. We had no relationship at all. In 1973, I was covering prisoners of war, the return of the POWs from Hanoi. I went out to Clark Air Base in the Philippines in February of 1973. To cover that return, and so for most of 73 I was covering that, POWs. When Gerald Ford was nominated to be vice president in October of 1973, my bureau chief called me in and said, Ford's going to be president. I don't know how long it's going to take, but Nixon's finished. At some point in the next year, Ford will be president, and I want somebody who knows him. Your job until he becomes president is to live with him, travel with him. That's all you do. And I was thrilled. I was 28 years old, and I said to myself, wow, this is a ticket to the White House, the most prestigious seat in government. And so for the next 8 or 9 months, that's what I did. I lived with him. He made about 60 trips. I made about 45 or 50 trips. He was sworn in as vice president on December the 6th, I believe, of 1973. His first trip with reporters was to Vail, Colorado at Christmas of 1973. I went on that trip, and from December 73 for the next 8 months, I traveled with him constantly. And it was an extraordinary time. It was a terrible time for the country. It was a bona fide constitutional crisis. Watergate, the break-in, a challenge to the executive branch by a special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, over Nixon's secret tape recordings. It eventually went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that a president could not withhold information from a criminal inquiry. He had to release the tapes. When he released the tapes, it became clear he'd been lying about his involvement in the Watergate cover-up. Ford was torn. He tried to walk a tightrope for those 8 months. It was a triple play. He was trying to be loyal to Nixon, his old friend. He was trying to be loyal to his conscience, and as those of us who travel with him quickly figured out, he was really torn by his loyalty to Nixon and his belief that Nixon was not telling him the truth. And also Ford was motivated by a desire to save his beloved Republican Party. He thought the party was going to go down the drain in 1974, and it absolutely did in the November congressional election. So he was out there trying to be loyal to Nixon, be loyal to his conscience, and be loyal to his party. The other thing that I give Ford credit for that I didn't recognize at the time, I was not smart enough and I was not old enough, but every time Ford went out on a trip, he'd have a press conference somewhere. Not every event, but every trip he'd have at least one press conference. And his questions, these questions were not softballs. They were, why are you supporting Nixon? Should he resign? And why don't you say he should resign? Should he turn over the tapes? Aren't you in fact an accessory to criminal conduct? He got tough questions. And he had a sense of what I call public accountability that I don't see much in this government and in this particular White House. I mean, the world has changed, the media has changed, public affairs has changed. This is an era of control freaks and being on message. They call it message discipline at the White House. But I thought that Ford rendered a really valuable public service by going out there and taking tough, mean, nasty, pointed questions every time he went out, and he was constantly out. I'm working on a book on President Ford, and I've been going through a lot of my old files. I have 10,000 pages of Newsweek files in my basement, and they're categorized in chronological order, so if I know something happened in the spring of 1974, I can go find it. And I'm struck by two things. I'm struck by how often Ford was out. I found a memo to my bosses at Newsweek where I was giving them Ford's schedule for 12 days. He was out of town 10 of those 12 days, and every one of those 10 trips was an out-and-back day trip, which started at 6 or 7 in the morning and ended at midnight. I don't know how any of us survived it other than the fact that we were all in our 20s at the time. He was 60. The other thing that struck me in going through some of my old files is how helpful his aides were, and when he became president and when Carter became president, they were all extremely helpful. This particular White House, and we'll probably come to this later, Martha, is very grudging in its help. They basically take the position that we don't have to help the press, with a few important exceptions. But so from December of 1973 until August of 1974, I traveled with Gerald Ford. And when he became president, I went to the White House with him. I was one of a handful of reporters invited to his first state dinner. He was sworn in on Friday, August the 9th, 1974. I was the magazine pool reporter on the South Lawn. So I was standing out there in that miserable humidity of August, Washington in August, as the Nixons and the Fords came out. I will never forget, Pat Nixon and Betty Ford embraced, and Ford and Nixon shook hands, and I couldn't see what they were saying, but they were talking, and Nixon walks up the steps of Army 1, In those days, it was an Army helicopter, not a Marine helicopter. At least that day, it was an Army helicopter. And Nixon goes to the top of the steps and he waves. And then almost as an afterthought, he did the one thing that people who didn't like him the most didn't like the most about him. He did the double V for victory, like that, and he got on the helicopter and flew off to California to await the judgment of history. And Ford was president. He was president for something like 896 days, something like that. He was very loyal to the 6 reporters who had traveled with him on Air Force Two all those many times. And he was very good to all of us after he left office. I stayed in close professional touch with him over the years. I would go out to interview him either in Colorado or California every couple of years or so. Mm-hmm. And then in 1991, I called his chief of staff and said I would like to come interview him every year off the record. I said, essentially, I want to do obituary interviews for as long as he lives. And I said, my rationale for that will be that he can be much more candid with me if he knows it won't be printed until after mm-hmm. he's dead. And he thought about it for a week, and his aide called back and said, you have a deal. So in 1991, I started these off-the-record interviews with Ford, which continued mm-hmm. until May of last year. I have the last interview with President Ford, May 11th of 2006, and I'm the last reporter to have seen him alive in November of 2006. It was a very short goodbye because at that point he could barely talk. Mm-hmm. He had trouble processing words, but I was glad to see him before he died. And so now I'm working on a book on Ford, Conversations with Ford, basically based on those interviews that I have not been able to print until after he was gone. I kept my word to him. I never used any of it, with one exception, and I got permission from him to use that one exception. And so stay tuned. The book's going to be out in the fall. But that's how I first got associated with President Ford. But I should say, Martha, that my White House corresponding goes back to Lyndon Johnson. I actually took a trip with Lyndon Johnson when I was a Newsweek intern in August of 1968. And I did a lot of travel with Richard Nixon. I did a lot of weekend travel to Key Biscayne, where Nixon liked to go on lots of weekends. He went to Florida more than he went to Camp David. And so I did a lot of traveling with Nixon. I probably made 25 or 30 trips with Nixon between the fall of 1970 and December of 1973 when I was reassigned to Ford. Mm-hmm. And so I always say that I've covered every president with Nixon, but if I wanted to stretch the resume a little bit, I could say every president since Lyndon Johnson. But I went out with Lyndon Johnson one day on a Saturday. He dedicated a dam in Tennessee. I never got anywhere near him, so I don't talk about that. I talk about 7 presidents, not 8.
Uh-huh. In talking about Nixon and Ford, and looking at the public images of them, and then seeing the people as you saw them in off-the-record situations, did you find that they were any different in public than they were in private, both Nixon and Ford?
Well, I did not. I really had no occasion to know Nixon. I never had an interview with Nixon. I encountered him only a couple of times. So I can't talk about his persona, his public versus private persona. I think Nixon, was very shy, which is unusual for a politician. He was very ill at ease. The couple of times I saw him, he would say things like, where are you from? Minneapolis. Oh, how are the Twins going to do this year? He always fell back on sports analogies because it was something that was easy for him to talk about. I think Nixon was socially awkward. He had demons. I think the demons are part to explain mm-hmm. why he got in trouble over Watergate. But he saw demons. He had enemies, real and imagined, and I think it got the better of him. Ford, however, in public was the same guy as he was in private. one of the things that I really loved about covering Vice President Ford was the intimacy of a little tiny airplane. If you go out to Andrews Air Force Base someday and you see Dick Cheney's Air Force Two, it's this massive 757 jumbo jet, silver and blue, very beautiful plane. It seats about 65 or 70 people. Gerald Ford's Air Force Two was this tiny little twin-engine prop jet. It was a Convair 580, and it seated 30, and it was really slow. It took 9 hours to get from Washington to California, and that's if you didn't have to refuel someplace because of the headwinds. It was so slow, this airplane was referred to by the press as Slingshot Airways. But the thing that was interesting about it is it didn't have a back door. It just had a front door. And the VIP cabin on that Air Force Two was in the back. The press sat up front. It's not the way it is now. The vice president and the president sit up front. The press sit in the way back of the airplane. So on that Air Force Two, Ford had to come through the press cabin to get to his cabin every time he got on the airplane. And I think it helped foster a sense of camaraderie and intimacy because we could grab him on the way back. And the thing about Jerry Ford was he liked reporters. He was a grown-up about reporters. He understood that the press will always bite the hand that feeds it. And by that I mean you can like reporters, you can get along with them, you can drink martinis with them, you can invite them to your house for barbecues. But if there's a story that's going to cause you heartburn, most reporters are going to write that story if it's there and true and legitimate, even if they happen to feel that you've been very nice to them on a social basis. And Ford got that. He understood it. George Bush 41 never understood that. I mean, he would invite reporters over to the White House for movies or other things. He would be very generous, and Bush 41 was a very generous guy personally. But sometimes a reporter would write something he didn't like, and he would say later, I don't understand this. I invited that SOB to a movie at the White House last month. Ford understood that taking a hit occasionally from reporters who you were doing nice things for, he understood that that was just the way it worked. But Ford in private was the same person as in public. I have written several times that Gerald Ford was an ordinary guy in the noblest sense of the term ordinary. He was probably the closest thing to a middle American as president that we'll ever see, with the possible exception maybe of Harry Truman. Mm-hmm. But Ford was exactly the same person in private. Mm-hmm. He had a temper, but he almost always kept it in check. One of his aides once said to me, Gerald Ford, this was before he died, he said, Gerald Ford was 98% koala bear and 2% grizzly bear. And the problem was you never knew when the grizzly bear was going to come out of the seat and grab you by your throat when you least expected it. So, so with that small exception, I think the private Gerald Ford was the same as the public Gerald Ford.
Where do you think he got that view of the press? Do you think that it related to his service on the Hill?
Well, I think so, Martha, because as you know, the Hill is so much of an easier beat to cover. Every time I go up and do a story or talk to a senator or a congressman, except for Hillary Clinton, who's very controlled, I'm always amazed how easy it is to function on the Hill, how easy it is to get people to talk with you. And maybe that's because it's the ethic on Capitol Hill is to be more open, that they've all got to account to constituents every 2 years or every 6 years, and so they're just more used to being open. It's easier as a reporter to deal on the Hill, and maybe because he was such a creature of the House, he was elected in 1948, and he took office in January of 1949, and from 49 to 73, which is what, 24 years, 23 and a half years, he was a creature of the Congress, and I think maybe that's where it came from. And it also came from the fact that he was a genuinely decent human being, just a nice guy. I mean, people have said to me, why do you think he agreed to this deal with you where you could come see him? Surely he was taking advantage of the opportunity to settle some scores, and I don't think that. I think he just did it because he was a nice guy. I also think he did it because he and I had an encounter in 1974 where he was very indiscreet with me, and he said a couple of things out of anger, not at me, but at something that had happened just that day. He said a couple of things he shouldn't say, and he immediately knew he shouldn't have. And it's one of my favorite stories, which I'm going to tell all in the book. And the bottom line was, he said to me, "You're not leaving this room until you promise me that you're not going to use that." And I was 28 years old. I was scared to death. And I was speechless. I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't speak. And it was one of those deals where people say your life passes in front of you. It was probably 15 seconds as he was standing there and I was standing there. And he had a hold of my tie. Mm-hmm. And I was frozen. I was petrified. He was the Vice President of the United States. And he finally said, "Write it when I'm dead." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Okay." And we shook hands on it, and I kept my word. I've never printed it, but I will later this year. But I think the fact that he was a nice guy is why he said yes to this project, and the fact that when I asked him about doing this arrangement in 1991, it had been 17 years since I sat on something that it was very important to him that I not publish. And so he knew, or at least he surmised, that I could be trusted because I'd kept my word. And so he said to himself, he'll keep his word on this one. But I don't think he had a Machiavellian bone in his body, and so I don't believe he did this out of any cynical motivation at all.
Did he ever talk about the role of the press in terms of its role in the society, whether it's a surrogate for the public?
He did, and I should have brought this with me. I've been going through all my Ford files, and about a week ago I found a transcript of a speech he made in Boston in May of 1974 in which he talked about his philosophy. And this is a paraphrase. He said to me, "I think it's important to have good relations with the press, not because we have to like them and not because we expect them to like us, but we should do that because it's one of the bulwarks of our democracy." He said, in a democracy, one of the reasons democracy works is that the people of a democracy have an independent source of information about what their government is doing. And in this democracy, whether you like it or not, it is the press, and they serve a critical function in that respect. And I thought it was, as I said, given my experience with this particular White House, which I have said many times are the biggest bunch of control freaks since the Nixon White House. They're not as hostile. It's not personal with this crowd, but it is a very controlling White House operation vis-a-vis the media. And Ford didn't see it that way. And I can remember a friend of mine once got to town. He was a rookie reporter for Newsday, the Long Island newspaper, and he called Ford one day at the office and he said, I'm going to have the weekend duty for the next year, and I'd like to get the phone number of somebody on your staff who, if something happens on the weekend, I can call them in a pinch. And he said, sure. And Ford gave him a phone number in Alexandria, Virginia, and he said, now who is this? He said, I need to know who to call. And he said, well, you better ask for me because that's my home phone number. Call me anytime. And that was just the way he was. Now, that's not the way he was when he became president, of course, but I think that's indicative of Ford's view of the press and his feeling that politicians needed to be available to the press because it was important to the proper functioning of the democracy.
Why do you think that is not the case in the current administration?
Well, it's a combination of things, Martha. I mean, the world has changed and the media has changed. I sometimes tell the story that in my very first White House briefing, which was sometime in the summer of 1968, George Christian was the press secretary. He was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary. There wasn't even a briefing room. Martha has spent dozens of hours in the briefing room. I have spent thousands of hours in that briefing room, more than I ever would wish on any human being. But there wasn't even a press room in those days. The briefing room was George Christian's office. an office that is now occupied by Tony Snow. And at my first briefing, there might have been 20 reporters in Christian's office. They were in his desk chairs, on his sofas, and several reporters were sitting around on the floor. And there were no cameras, there were no TV cameras, there were no print cameras. It was just asking questions of George Christian. And we now know what has happened now. There are 2 briefings a day. One is not on camera, the other one is on camera. The other thing that, of course, has changed is 2 other things. The news cycle. In the old days, you had to worry about 2 cycles, the morning news shows, the Today Show, and the evening news programs. And that's really all you had to prepare yourself for. And I guess you could say also that if you were at the White House, you had to prepare yourself for the Monday news magazine. So maybe there were 3 cycles. Mm-hmm. But now you have constant cycles, because that's the other change in the process. You had no cable. You had 3 networks. There was no CNN, there was no MSNBC, there was no CNBC, there was no Fox News, there was no C-SPAN, there was nothing but 3 commercial television networks. And so there is now this insatiable demand to fill the news vacuum. Mm-hmm. And so any White House has to have an apparatus that can deal with, what's your comment on this, 24 hours a day. And it's ratcheted up everything. And then just the sheer numbers of reporters, the sheer numbers of news outlets just make it far more prodigious a task to get your message out and manage the news. That's part of it. The other part of it is this White House early on made a conscious decision that they didn't need the press. They had to help the wires and the networks and the New York Times and to a lesser extent the Washington Post. But for the most part, the media strategy put together even before Bush was elected president basically boiled down to this. We think we don't have to go out of our ways to be helpful to the press. We can always adjust our calculation if it proves to be wrong. But we don't think we have to do that, and I think that's really been their guiding principle. There are lots of things they could be helpful on that they're not helpful on. One of my favorite bad stories, one of my favorite bad stories has to do with Gerald Ford. His 90th birthday was on July the 14th of 2003. President Bush threw a very nice birthday party for him in the state dining room. There have been several reporters had always been invited to an annual alumni dinner, which Ford used to throw the first Monday in June every year. Mm-hmm. And the expectation was that this particular annual event, the reporters would be invited. No reporters were invited. They said it was for space. That's baloney. The White House, when you do things at the White House controls the number of people, and so there were no reporters there. But I wanted to get a copy of President Bush's remarks about President Ford, because I think, as I've explained, I have a more than a casual interest in President Ford. I couldn't get it. I was first told that President Bush's remarks, that there was a transcript, was not made. Well, I knew that was baloney because by statute, the White House Correspondents Association, White House Communications Agency, the White House Communications Agency is required to tape these sorts of interviews. That doesn't mean they have to be released, but when I was told no tape was made of this, I knew that was not true. And I challenged the White House press office, and they went back and they said, well, yes, but we don't release these sorts of things. And I knew from friends of mine who had been at this very nice birthday party that Bush had been totally generous, totally benign. There was nothing controversial. There was nothing sensitive about it. It was George Bush being a nice guy about one of his predecessors. And it took me almost 3 months of complaining to finally get a copy of Bush's remarks. And Scott McClellan said to me, here they are, please don't tell anybody where these came from. I mean, he got permission to give them to me. And in the old days, those remarks would have been routinely distributed. They would have been in the weekly compilation of presidential documents. They were totally benign, totally innocuous, and as I would have suspected, they made President Bush look very good, nice, decent, and generous. It was just, we don't help people on things like this. And it was stupid, it was counterproductive. I have said many a time, I don't say it anymore because for the most part this operation has a closed mind about these sorts of matters. I used to remind people in this press operation of something that the first President Bush said in his only inauguration. He had a line that said, "Goodwill begets goodwill." Now, he wasn't talking about the press, he was talking about Iran. But I think that's a universal concept. Goodwill begets goodwill, and I think this White House consciously made a decision that we don't have to worry about goodwill because we don't really need the press. Now, if Dan Bartlett were here, he would say that's a crock. Well, he can say what he wants.
He's going to be here April 3rd.
Oh, good. Well, he doesn't like anything I write, so I'm sure he'll say that's a crock. He'll say we go out of our way to be helpful to the press, and we disagree.
As the bureau chief, do you hear from the White House?
Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot, because remember, I'm a bureau chief, but I'm a bureau chief for the 5th largest paper in America, but it's not a paper they feel like they have to care about. Again, it's back to their media plan. That was the other thing, just by contrast of how things have changed. Even in the Nixon administration, the Nixon folks were smart enough to figure out that you need to try to cultivate the press. You need to try to be helpful at some level to the press. And I will never forget that the Nixon press office carved up the world, the media world, into constituencies. And somebody was deputized to try to be helpful. Sometimes it was Ron Ziegler, sometimes it was others. And I know that the Nixon speechwriters were deputized to try to be helpful to the news magazines. I was working for Newsweek magazine at the time. And each of the 3 speechwriters were authorized to try to be helpful however they could, because the speechwriters had a flair for the written word, and the news magazines are always looking for color and tidbits and what happened, what did Reagan really say when he got on the phone with Menachem Begin? What was Nixon eating when he discovered this or that, menu items? And so the speechwriters each had a news magazine. And as I recall, Ray Price, who was one of Nixon's speechwriters, was the Newsweek person, and he tried to give a few little tidbits, innocuous stuff, nothing that would be, no secrets. But my point is, even despite the great hostility between the press and the Nixon apparatus was smart enough to understand that we ought to try to have some sort of a relationship with all the various constituencies of the media. That's not the case here. Again, they don't think they have to worry about me or about my paper, and so I don't get any special treatment. I basically don't get any treatment at all. But that's okay, because it's been a very long time since I believed I have a God-given right to be helped by anybody. My basic philosophy is people that I cover don't owe me anything. Somebody who's helpful to me is always going to get some benefit of the doubt, as opposed to somebody who's not helpful to me. But I do not punish or penalize anybody who doesn't help me. I don't know, given the nature of these jobs in the White House, I don't know how anybody has time to spend any time with the press. So whenever I get help, I'm very grateful for it, but I do not believe I have a divine right to be helped. I do think that most of the time it's not very smart to work hard at alienating reporters. I should tell you also that for 22 years I was a public affairs officer in the United States Army. 2 years on active duty, 20 years, almost 20 years in the reserve. So I really feel like when you're talking about the media, I feel like I deal with this from both sides of the barricades. As a military public affairs officer, I understand that there are things you just can't talk about. So I think I like to believe that I'm a little more balanced on issues of coverage because of my military public affairs background than a lot of other reporters.
What do you think about a theory, which is one I'm using in my book, that White Houses reflect a president, they don't complement him, so that what he is strong in, the White House, his White House staff is going to be strong in, and what he's weak in, they're also going to be weak. You would think in one way that with all the staff slots that you've got, that you could use those to complement a president. A president could think, well, I'm weak in this area, so I need to hire people here. But in reality, what they do is they put their energies where their talents are. So that, say, Ronald Reagan had a first-class communications operation, in part because he was such a good communicator himself. George H.W. Bush was not interested in communications and didn't put attention to that. He put attention to a good press operation, but he didn't do the kind of planning that Reagan did. And that in this administration, it's the president himself that feels as if that he doesn't need to explain things in detail. And so the press operation reflects that.
Well, I think there are exceptions to every rule. Well, that sounds pretty much right to me, Martha. I should also tell the class that from 1987 to 1993, I had 18 interviews with George W. Bush. This is long before he was president, long before he was governor of Texas. They were all on background, meaning that I couldn't quote him as being my source, but everything he told me I could use. Mm-hmm. This is when he was a part-time troubleshooter and political advisor to his father in the 1988 and 1992 presidential campaigns. He was one of my best sources. Again, I had 18 interviews with him. I saw him over on 15th Street, not far from here at the Bush headquarters. I saw him in his office on the north side of Dallas, and I sometimes would see him at Texas Ranger baseball games. He knew that I was from Arlington, Texas, which is where the Texas Rangers play. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I would call him in Dallas and I would say, I hear you're going to be in town the week after next. I'd like to get some time with you. And Bush would say to me, he would say, he says, that's true, but I've got a better idea. He said, the Red Sox are in town next week. He says, why don't you fly down next week? Newsweek can pay for it. He hated Newsweek. He said, Newsweek can pay for it. You can go see your mom and dad. We'll go to a baseball game, and you can pull out your notebook and interview me. So we did that 4, 5, 6 times from 87, 88, and 91 and 92. And so I feel like I've got a very good take on his personality. It's interesting to note that since he's become president, I've never had an interview, and I don't expect to have an interview, notwithstanding the fact that I feel like I had a very good personal relationship with him. That's just an interesting phenomenon. Again, I don't think he owes me an interview, but I think you might ask Dan Bartlett about that. Uh-huh. But the fact is, I think you have his persona right. I don't think he is personally hostile to the press. I think he's somewhere between Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, where Nixon thought the press was out to get him, and Gerald Ford thought they were essentially decent and they needed to be helped. I think Bush 43 is somewhere in between there. I think he understands that the media, he believes very strongly that the media is essentially elitist and therefore somewhat hostile to him, but he's not totally paranoid about it. And he recently has been giving more interviews. Yeah. And so he's somewhere in the middle, I would say. He's
been doing a series of off-the-record interviews, and he did some in, I guess, in the spring as well. And this particular set seems to have been long. That reporters might go in for an hour and a half. And in asking people what the difference is in what they see between the president in public and the president in that off-the-record setting. And people talk about how much more relaxed he is, how in command of detail he seems to be. Do you think that that's a reflection of most presidents when they go on stage, that they tighten up and that they're just looser in that kind of setting?
Well, yeah, because if you're off the record or on background, one, you have more time, and two, you can be more candid, more open, and just more informative. I can remember one of my favorite stories is a reporter who went to one of these things several years ago with Bush, and he couldn't believe, he had a specific interest in a specific subject, and he could not believe how well informed Bush was on this. He could not believe how detailed the president's knowledge was on this particular issue. And the next day, some press officer asked this reporter how the thing had gone, and he said exactly what I've just said to you. And the press officer said, "Yeah, that's our problem. He's the leaker in chief sometimes," talking about his boss, the President of the United States. So just a little insight into how the press operation runs.
What did you find when you interviewed him in the period before he came into office and when he was working for his father? What kinds of interests did he have?
He was very focused on protecting his father. I mean, he saw his job as being his father's eyes and ears inside the campaign. He saw his job as being an enforcer, and to give his father early warning about situations that he thought were a problem. He also saw his job as an emissary, as a facilitator, as a transition belt. In the 1992 Newsweek book, a book about the 1992 campaign called Quest for the Presidency, which was published in 1994, there's a fascinating little anecdote, and it's not fascinating because I was the reporter, but it's fascinating, and I think you'll understand this. The Bushes thought that one of the problems was John Sununu, the White House Chief of Staff. And President Bush asked his son, George W. Bush, to contact about 25 of Bush's closest political advisors, asking them for advice on what they should do, what he should do to get ready for the 92 campaign. This was after an election in 1991 where a Pennsylvania Senate election in November of 91 where Harris Wofford, the Democrat, beat Dick Thornburgh, a very popular Republican. And this defeat, a year before the 92 election, sent tremors all through the Republican political establishment because Thornburgh was supposed to have won. And so President Bush asked his son, Bush sent a letter to about 25 of his closest political associates, some on the staff, some of his friends, political advisors, political consultants, gurus, and he sent out this letter saying, I've asked son George to contact all of you. I need your best advice about what I should do. It'll be absolutely confidential. The only two people who know what you say will be George and me. And that was a device to, one, get information, and two, to help grease the skids for John Sununu, because there was a feeling that many of these close advisors to President Bush thought that Sununu should go, but they didn't have the guts to say so. There is a celebrated dinner that Bush had a few days after this election with 20 or 30 of his closest associates, and they just kicked around, what should I do? And several of them wanted to say, I think you need to change chiefs of staff, but none of them had the guts to say so because Sununu was in the room. Yeah. So anyway, that's what George W. Bush's role was. Fact finder, transmission belt, enforcer. I can remember once that Barbara Bush was very upset with Lee Atwater, who had done an interview in Esquire magazine talking about his importance in the campaign. And it was famous around the Bush campaign because Atwater allowed himself to have a picture taken of him in boxing shorts and boxing gloves. Mm-hmm. And Barbara Bush thought this was unseemly for the Bush political director mm-hmm. to be in this pose in boxing shorts and boxing gloves. And the very first time I ever spoke to George, my very first interview with George W. Bush, he mentioned this to me, and he talked about how he had gone to Atwater and been very direct about this sort of thing. So I think that's sort of the thing he saw. And he talked to me many a time about the need for loyalty. I have said for years and years and years that one of the genetic traits of the Bush clan is that when push comes to shove, they always they value loyalty over competence. Mm-hmm. And I had always felt that way about his father. But when in these 18 interviews with George W. Bush, I saw exactly the same phenomenon from the son as I did from the father. And I think we see that now and then in situations where he has kept aides that others thought should have gone long before, like Don Rumsfeld, just to name one. There were a series of articles. There were 2 articles in the Washington Post last week. This is going to be asking you about Bush and why Bush did not respond in this case. There were articles in the Washington Post about the treatment of Iraq war veterans in the off-campus housing at Walter Reed, and the conditions were certainly shoddy. Bush has spent a lot of time at Walter Reed and has been very interested in veterans and talks about them a lot. And the White House did not respond to that story, really. I think everybody expected the president, either personally or through his press secretary or through somebody, to demonstrate outrage and over it. And I'm wondering, what is your take of why he didn't? Was he did not want to criticize government department? He was going to leave it to Gates because Gates was coming in new, leaving it to him to handle? I don't have a good answer for that, Martha. I was also struck that seemed to be a slam dunk for him. But this is just speculation. If I knew this, I would say it and write it, but I don't know this. So I'm just guessing. I suspect, and you ought to ask Dan Bartlett the question, I suspect the president said to himself, or somebody said, that it would just remind people that he is the commander-in-chief of a war that 2/3 of the American people don't support any longer. To me, it would have been the smart political thing just to have come out and said, I'm appalled, I'm shocked. Or you don't do it that way. I mean, I guess if I had been his press spokesman, I would have said, you come out and say, I am distressed at these stories. I think he basically should have said what Bob Gates said. But I don't think there would have been any downside to that at all. But I mean, that sounds to me like handlers saying, well, we can't remind people that he's the architect of this war. And I think that was an opportunity missed. I mean, this goes back to one of my overarching views of various White Houses' views of the press. I think some White Houses believe that the media is an opportunity to be exploited. I think that was the Reagan view, the Reagan White House view. Other White Houses basically say that the media is a pitfall to be avoided. I think that's the way this particular administration views the press. Something, a pitfall to be avoided, a danger to be sidestepped. But I think the president could have shown some humanity, because there's no doubt that he cares very deeply about about all of this. I just think that the hidden cost of this war and what it's done to tens of thousands of soldiers who will never be whole is going to be one of the continuing scandals of the war, and I feel very strongly about that. I should say, well, you know, I've got a military background, and some of my friends, a few of my classmates are even on active duty still, and I have pretty good sources in the military community, and there's a lot of anger within the military about the lousy care that some of our wounded have gotten, and I think it's a function of the sheer magnitude of the numbers. I do believe when Rumsfeld was there, the Pentagon was discouraged from leveling about the true magnitude of the problem, and I think it's come back to hurt them.
In covering the Clinton administration, and let's say Clinton, Bush 1, and Reagan, what were the differences with this administration in terms of what kind of information one could be given and what kind of information one could find?
Well, the Clinton administration was much more in the category of an opportunity to be exploited. They talked to reporters a lot. They were very sophisticated about it. They could be fairly disciplined. There was a fair amount of discipline, but they basically tried to be helpful. They felt like the press was a useful vessel to help spread their message. They were not totally antagonistic. As the Clinton scandals developed and accelerated, there was more and more distress towards the media, and it got a little trickier. But I think basically most reporters who covered the Clinton White House feel like they had a reasonably decent time with it. But I was on book leave for a fair amount of that time, so I'm not the best. I'm not the best source on that.
Last year we had Ken Bazinet, who was a White House correspondent for you, who talked about the Clinton years.
Ken was there the whole time, and he's the best guy.
Yeah,
for that.
and he certainly had a lot of sources in the administration.
And that's great for me because many of those sources have now fanned out into the political community. He's got Obama sources, he's got Edwards sources, he's got Hillary sources, and many of them are sources that he first got to know in the 8 years of the Clinton administration.
When a White House closes up, where do you get information?
Well, one of the ways you get information is to go talk to people who are in there all the time. And not surprisingly, one of the most fertile targets of opportunity is Capitol Hill. You're always having congressmen and senators come down to the White House, and given what I said earlier about the kind of more open, generically, the Capitol Hill is a more open and more accessible place for the media. You can go to senators and congressmen and their staffs, and sometimes they will tell you things about what are going on at the White House. You could also talk to political consultants, to special interest groups who are invited down for meetings or who have friends in the political shop. You have to do it indirectly, but there are always people to talk to who know something about what's going on at the White House. I think this administration has probably been the most successful that I can remember in keeping things closely held. But there are other ways you can try to get information.
Well, let's go have some questions. Anybody have a question?
Yeah. Based on your experience as a public affairs officer, what do you think of the military's public affairs work dealing with Iraq and the job of the media in covering Iraq?
Well, I get that question. I get that question a fair amount of time. I think the military public affairs operation reflects the view of its superiors, and until recently, the views of the superiors was we don't talk much. it's been hard to get a lot of information out of this Pentagon and out of this Iraq operation. I am all for the embedding process, and I know a lot of public affairs and officers involved in that, and I think the process of embedding reporters with units is a good one. It's a good one for the press because you get a good slice of life about what it's really like out there. And I think it's useful for the military because it gives a population which is more and more ignorant. I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I just mean it in the realistic sense, ignorant about the military. One of the few downsides of the volunteer military is that when there was a draft, and I'm not arguing for a return to the draft. I don't think we should do that. But when there was a draft, you had a cross-section of America coming in and being exposed to the military for 6 months or a year or maybe a little bit longer. And there are more and more and more Americans who know nothing about the military culture these days. There's fewer and fewer members of Congress who have ever served. You have a vice president who never served. So there are more and more public officials who were not in the military, and I think as a matter of public policy over the long run, that's not so good. And so when you have reporters, even in a controlled environment like Iraq and Afghanistan, when you have reporters embedded, they're able to tell the public more about the military and just inform people who don't know that much about the military. And I think as a practical matter, that's got to be good. On the other hand, we in the military have a phrase for this, OPSEC, operational security, and many times operational security is used as a rationale for not being helpful. Now, there are lots of times when OPSEC is paramount and important, and you can't talk about things. Sometimes it's used as a crutch to withhold information. But I think by and large, most public affairs officers I know are trying to be helpful as opposed to trying to hinder the flow of information. And to the extent that information is not passed on, I think more often than not it's commanders who either are worried about what their superiors will think or think if you talk too much to the press it could hurt your career.
Another question?
Looking back on your career, the experiences you've gone through, and knowing what you know now, what advice would you have given yourself 38 years ago at the beginning of your career? And would you give the same advice to aspiring journalists today? And would it be slightly different because of the rise of technology and its impact on news media?
Well, I didn't hear all of that.
Your advice, and as aspiring journalists.
No, that
Yeah,
part of it I
and
heard, but I didn't
looking
hear
back.
the first part about the early part of my career.
What advice would you have given yourself 38 years ago as you were beginning your career?
Yeah, what advice would you give yourself if you were now going back?
Well, I would not, in my case, I would not have gotten a master's degree in journalism. I have a bachelor's and a master's both in journalism. If I had that to do all over again, I would have gotten a master's in anything but journalism. I should have had more liberal arts than I had. I had a minor, I had a master's in journalism with a minor in history, but I should have had more political science, more sociology, more generic liberal arts, more philosophy, more of a literal, truly liberal arts education. I am glad I had a bachelor's in journalism, but I'm sorry that I got a master's in journalism, especially since it was at the University of Minnesota, which was a year I loved, but it was not. University of Minnesota journalism at that time was a journalism research oriented curriculum, and that's not me. I'm anything but a journalism research sort of person. But basically, more experience. I mean, as an aspiring journalist now, you need to be able to show potential employers as much as experience as you can. Weekends. I started out as a campus stringer at Texas A&M, and then I became a campus stringer for Newsweek magazine at the University of Minnesota, and then I became an intern at Newsweek. And more liberal arts, but experience always counts. I guess the other advice would be be more skeptical. When I first got to the White House, a reporter for the Washington Star, an old-timer who'd been there a long time, said, "Son, here's the way we do it. They tell us, and we write it down." I think for a long time there was a tendency in the White House press corps to be too trusting, to accept at face value what we were being told. Now, it's always tricky because reporters by discipline and by instinct are taught to be skeptical. And I think skepticism is healthy. The problem in this town is that sometimes the distance between a healthy skepticism and an unhealthy cynicism is not that great, and sometimes, some would say far too often, reporters lapse over from skepticism into cynicism. But at the start, I would say be more willing to challenge what you're being heard. Every White House I've ever covered wants you to believe it is the way they say it is. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And a healthy dose of skepticism about what you're being told, I think, is critical.
Or you could say Reagan said, "Trust but verify," in a different circumstance. Was the Washington Post reporter Eddie Folliard?
No, it was Washington Star.
Oh, Star.
It was a guy named
Jack Horner.
Named Jack Horner of the Washington Star, an old-timer, Garnett D. Horner, Jack Horner.
Yeah.
And I think of him every once in a while because when I go home, I live on Capitol Hill, lived on Capitol Hill for 31 years, and going home, I go past the Washington Star building, which I think is vacant now. I think it may even be owned by the Washington Post. Maybe they sold it, but they owned it at one point. And I'll go by the old Washington Star building on Virginia Avenue Southeast, and I'll think of Jack Horner. Mm-hmm. That was a great newspaper. A lot of distinguished journalists worked at the Washington Star. Maureen Dowd, Fred Barnes, my friend. Lots of famous reporters worked at the Washington Star. Late and lamented Washington Star.
And in the 19th century, it was, the latter part of the 19th century, it was the paper in Washington. If you go back and you want to look at how the White House was covered, it really was the Evening Star.
That's another phenomenon, as Martha well knows. It's the decline of the afternoon paper. There are not that many of them left.
Yeah.
Tell us the importance of parlaying information with BBC, for instance, out of the White House communication to the public. Journalism being a job, as you pointed out, acquiring information and presenting that to the public as media, understanding that. Then again, doing it with technical information. So where do you go, I guess, comment on what's important to be presented to the people, what you feel is important, and if there's some kind of a shade of gray there, why do you feel that it's important?
Well, why do I feel the dissemination of information is important? Because, as President Ford once said, and I absolutely agree, that one of the reasons that democracies work is that the people who live in a democracy have an independent source of information about what's going on in the government. Look, for example, at these stories in the Washington Post about the problems with wounded Walter Reed. If we didn't have a press willing to print that sort of stuff, we still wouldn't know that would be the case. And I think that is a national scandal, and I think heads should roll at the Pentagon, and I think it's important that the American people know what that's all about. And I think in this democracy, the media is a vehicle for that. I mean, the more informed people are, the better a democracy, the healthier a democracy is. So that's basically the way I look at it. Now, if you're asking me, how do you decide what you print and what you don't print? Every reporter is a gatekeeper. Every day, we all decide what's important and what's not important, and that there is a subjective quality to that analysis. I'm always deciding what are the essential elements of information in whatever it is I'm writing. what's significant, what's not significant, what's more significant or what's less significant. And one of the problems when people talk about the media, I always say the media, there's no such thing as the media. The media is not a corporation called the Media Incorporated with a board that sits down and says every 3 months, all right, who do we stick it to this quarter? The media is a confederation of fiefdoms. And these fiefdoms have very different roles of what's news and roles of what should be printed. You have the networks, you have the wire services, you have the daily newspapers, you have the news magazines, you have the monthlies, you have the cable shows, you have quasi news organizations, and all these organizations have different standards and different views. The press is not monolithic at all. Years ago, one night on the NBC Evening News, the NBC Evening News showed a couple of black and white photographs from President Kennedy's autopsy. I thought that was in poor taste. I would never have published those. Not because I didn't think NBC had a right to do it, but because I just thought that was tasteless. The New York Times printed the name of the alleged rape victim in the William Kennedy Smith rape trial. I would not have printed her name. So the media is a collection of fiefdoms, and they all have different judgments about what's news, what's not news, what's in good taste, what's in poor taste, and also in the extreme, what you can publish without damaging national security and what you can't. And the problem is that in journalism school there's not a nice little manual that says if you know this you can print it, and if you don't know it you don't, and if you know this you shouldn't or can't print that. Every case is a little bit different, and that's what makes our job tricky.
In your years reporting, in looking at a White House, is what constitutes news from the White House? Has that been pretty much the same whether you're working for Newsweek or whether you're working at the Daily News?
Well, I think it's the same. The White House defines news as that which we want the American people to know in a light that casts us the most favorably.
What about for you? Your idea of what news is? Has it been consistent over time, no matter what medium you're working in?
Well, I've only worked in two mediums: daily newspapers for 10 years and weekly news magazines for 25 years. But basically, I'm not a philosopher. I'm more of just a kind of a simple reporter. I'm not an oracle. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a reporter. So I think my basic view of news is what makes a good story. It's as simple as that. And probably, since I come out of the news magazine genre, I put more emphasis on inside the room, color, detail, quotes, what a president said when he was on the phone with this guy, which is next to impossible to get in this White House. But basically, it's just whatever I can find out that will inform my readers better about what's going on in government, and that's basically my core mission every day that I try to write.
Another question?
From your interviews with President Ford and your friendship with him, how do you think he felt the course George W. Bush was taking the country was going?
I heard the stuff about Ford, but I didn't understand.
In the course of your interviews with Ford, what did he think over the course of time about the direction that George W. Bush was taking the country?
Well, that's a good question, because it changed, and I guess it changed kind of along the lines of how well or how poorly the Iraq War was going. Some of you may know that after Ford died on December 26th of last year, I did a fair amount of television, and for a couple of days there I seemed to be butting heads with Bob Woodward, because Bob Woodward came on the day after Ford had died and did an interview with Larry King Live, talking about his interview from several years ago where Ford said that he would not have gone into Iraq. Now, I'm sure Ford said it because Woodward had it on tape, but I'll bet you that Ford had that in a slightly different context. And the reason I say that is, and I'll come back to a more specific answer to your question. The reason I say that is that I have dozens of instances with President Ford where he always prefaced, he didn't like to zing people without trying to be a little softer. He would always bathe a barb with a little balm, if I can mess up my metaphors there. And here's a good example. In my last interview with Ford from last May, I asked him what he thought about Bush's domestic surveillance program, and he didn't like it. But here's the way he answered. He said, well, I know I don't have all the information here. It's probably not the worst thing any president has ever done. But I was surprised they did it, and I would have never done it myself, and I'm sorry that they felt like they needed to do it. Now, that is not what I would describe as a full-blown assault on the policy. It was kind of like a more sorrow than anger response. That's the way Ford talked. And so I will bet you, when he said to Bob Woodward what he clearly said to Bob Woodward, I'll bet you he said it in a similar context to the one that I just described. I don't know. I don't intend to ask Bob. It's his business. But I'm just betting that Ford would have said something like this. Well, I'm not the commander-in-chief. I don't have the intelligence, so I don't know what was going on there. But in retrospect, since you've asked me a direct question, I would have to say that knowing what I know now, I probably would not have gone into Iraq. I'll bet you anything that's the way Ford would have said that. But now, on your specific question there, I had 4 interviews with Ford after the war in Iraq began in the spring of 2003. And in every one of those 4 interviews, he was supportive of the war in Iraq. In the last 2 interviews, and this is where Bob Woodward's reporting and my reporting converge, in my last 2 interviews with Ford, he said to me that he thought it was a big mistake to have pegged the reason for going into Iraq on weapons of mass destruction. And he said to me twice, Saddam Hussein was an evil man and there was plenty of justification to invade Iraq and take him out. But Bush made the wrong call. And Ford also said to me that in his last 3 weeks before I saw Ford for my last interview with him, he and President Bush had spent an hour together in California, and Ford told me that he said that same thing about the WMD mistake to Bush. So his view evolved. One of the tricky things I'm having to deal with in this book is that his view of people sometimes evolved, and it got a little mellower as he got older. It got a little mellower with Reagan belatedly. He didn't really mellow with vis-a-vis Reagan until after Reagan came down with Alzheimer's. He mellowed on Jimmy Carter. He blew hot and cold on Bill Clinton. And I think one of the problems when historians look at the transcript of these interviews, which I guess I'm going to give to somebody at some point down the road after the book is published, they will have to sort out, what does this mean that in 1998 he said this about President X, and in 2002 he said this about President X, and it's a little different. I mean, it's going to be a tricky problem for historians. Okay.
What about Woodward's discussion of the pardon of Nixon, dealing with his friendship? That he was a friend.
I think that Bob, and I have great respect for Bob as a reporter, I just think he got that wrong. I mean, I hate to do things like this, Martha, but on this I'm going to have to say up to a point, wait till the book, because
Yeah.
some of that is
Well,
going
that's
some of that's coming out, but I can
understandable.
answer it partially, and I would answer it this way. I think that Ford considered himself a very good friend of Nixon. Ford and Richard Nixon were charter members of a Republican social group called the Chowder and Marching Society. Ford was the last surviving member of that society at his death. He and Nixon were founding members, with several other members of Congress, of the Chowder and Marching Society. Ford always considered himself to be a good friend of Nixon, but Ford once said to me, 10 years ago, and I thought it was very telling. He said to me, Nixon and I were close to the extent that anybody could be close to Dick Nixon. And I think that is very pregnant. And so I think he thought he was a very good friend of Nixon. But the notion that they were really close and the reason that he pardoned Nixon was because they were dear friends, I think that's baloney. I just don't think that's right. And I maybe am, that sounds a little arrogant given the fact that Woodward is such a great reporter. But Woodward had 4 or 5 hours of interviews with Ford. I have more than 50 interviews with Ford over 33 years, including maybe 25 or 30 interviews with him after he left office. And so I have no doubt that what Ford said to Woodward is accurate, but I don't think it's, in every case, I don't think it has the complete context that it needs to be. But it's ironic because that's what a lot of people say about the press generically. Well, you got these two interviews, but the story, there's more to that story, and you didn't. If you'd done 6 interviews, if you'd spent 20 hours on this story instead of an hour and a half one afternoon, you'd see that you don't have the whole picture, and I think that's probably a valid criticism sometimes.
Okay, one more question.
Do you think that bloggers are helping to advance general distrust of journalists?
I do, but I think bloggers are a mixed bag. I mean, bloggers, some of them are very smart, some of them are very good, and let's face it, as I'm sure many of you know, it was bloggers who discovered that the infamous Texas Air National Guard memo that was Dan Rather's downfall was a fake. And so I think bloggers are here to stay. I think they're important and they're sometimes useful because many of them are real specialists and experts. But the problem with bloggers as journalists is where are the standards? Where's the editor? Where's the person who says, do you really know this is true? What's your sourcing on this? Do you have one source? Do you have 2 sources? Did you check this? And so that's the downside of blogging. But I think bloggers are journalistically useful. Some of them, I think, some bloggers, as you suggest, can be detrimental to the view of reporters and reporting by the general media. But whether you like bloggers or don't like bloggers, they're not going away. It's just like somebody said to me years ago. I was making a speech and said, "Who elected you to tell us what you think?" And I said, "Nobody elected me." That's like saying, "Who gave General Motors the right to build cars?" Nobody gave General Motors the right to build cars, but that's what they do, and that's what we in the press do. Just like you don't have to buy a General Motors car, you don't have to listen to us if you don't want to. If you don't like CNN, you got Fox. If you don't like the New York Daily News, you can read the New York Post. If you don't like the Washington Post, you can read the Washington Times or the Washington Examiner. There are other options, and so bloggers are here to stay, just like the media is here to stay. Although I agree the people who say the market forces are really changing the way journalism is evolving these days. And I never thought I'd say I'm glad to be a reporter at 61, but if I were a reporter at 51, my future might be a little trickier than it is at the moment.
Well, thank you very much.
I've really had a really good time. It's always fun to do these sorts of things. I appreciate your questions and I appreciate your interest, and I hope we'll be able to do it again one of these days. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Sit up there.